Hey everybody! Well, I tried to do it like Sean, but my voice is not quite that pitch. Hi everyone, my name is Ken Auguillard. I am a principal program manager, and I am joined by...
Smooth baritone Ken. I am joined by Wendy Haddad. I am Wendy Haddad. I am a senior cloud solution architect, delivery lead, and a former Microsoft customer. As you may notice, Sean and Jocelyn are enjoying a nice vacation while all of us are working very hard here at the podcast. So Ken and I holding down the fort. But I am joined by Carsten Groth, Global Black Belt in the Power Platform. Carsten, how are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. Nice to be back on this. Yeah, so feeling fine, feeling good, sunny weather outside, so all refreshed in terms of thinking about any kind of automation pieces today, right?
Absolutely. Well, hey, we wanted to have you on because I actually noticed a blog post that you recently wrote about basically the difference between traditional automation and AI powered workflows. So before we get into some of the questions and nuance about that, why don't you tell us how this came about? What inspired you to write that post?
No, absolutely. So part of my role as being a global black belt is to bridge the kind of gap between product group in Redmond and also our field teams in terms of their subject matter expertise. So sitting in front of customers, typically C-level style, and help them to understand our technology stack. So help them understand, for instance, when we are doing announcements such as the computer use automation. So that was basically the side when I figured out that I got a lot of feedback also on my LinkedIn side. So people were approaching me, people were pinging me and asking stuff like, hey, Microsoft has recently announced this kind of new automation thing. And it seems that this one is now using LLM, AI technology. So what's behind this? What is it? And then after a couple of running shows, if you will, or as we call it, executive briefing centers, and running customers through this, I thought of, you know what? Can I help better to understand these kind of puzzle pieces? And can I help scale this out more broadly? So I've been using my blog post for this to let people know about that they should embrace this kind of new technology.
All right, so Karsten, well articulated, but I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
What exactly is it?
Yeah, so we recently announced the new support for using computer use automation. So what is it? It's basically that there's an instance of a large language model, LLM, which is artificial intelligence using to simulate what a human being would do when, for instance, fill up a form on a customer, let's say, incident portal. Whenever you're creating on that portal, let's say you're creating an incident and that incident has a kind of a form that you need to run through. So first name given, last name given, what's the subject, what kind of issues you're facing. Hey, let's attach a file, for instance, or a document that helps further explaining what was going on. These kind of things all of a sudden being done by a computer. And that's a new way of taking the fact of what, for instance, was previously done also by machines or by computers, but it was done on a robotic process automation style. So RPA was the previous world, if you will, and it still exists. And then there's the CUI part, which is now this new artificial intelligence. Does it help you?
Well, I want to double click there. So, robotic process automation, what was the limit? I mean, we had something before that was already doing the automation. So, I think a lot of times I'm hearing both organizations being excited about AI, but then I get the skeptics who tell me, well, that's just a bunch of hype and it's not actually producing value. So, what were the limitations that we were running into with robotic process automation that warrants needing now an AI process or AI tool injected into the process?
Wendy's over here reading my mind.
Yeah, and this
We think
is
alike.
this is a question I often face in terms of the C-level. Help me understand these kind of things. And I think we need to step back a little bit and turn wheels back a little bit, which means talking about where was robot process automation coming from. And this robotic process automation was basically a bridging technology which helped in the days where we had systems which wasn't accessible through an API interface. So we were always trying to get data from systems of records, for instance. And the typical approach when we were jumping into that cloud era was that we were all facing the days of we should all have an API where we are accessing this and then get the data back from the systems of record. Well, the reality was there was not often these days where we had all the software being inclusive in terms of having an API, which means that we need a bridging technology for that. And that bridging technology was basically robotic process automation, which means that we had a machine. That machine could run as a virtual instance and that could basically start my client simulating the way that I would run with my mouse through this UI interface and then basically do all these kind of data entry stuff for me. And that was the bridging technology to face the times where we do have systems which didn't have any kind of API interface. Nowadays, we do have more and more API systems and more API that we can attach to, but that doesn't mean that all these kind of things, we still have mainframes, for instance, that do exist. We still have older systems, and I'm talking about real old, sometimes COBOL-based systems that still have this kind of UI interface where there's no API attached to this. So we needed to find a way of basically going through these kind of things. And that was bridging technology. And if we compare this to the new era of AI, that is obviously something where we can help people to use the new technology, use the new large language models to better overcome these kind of human actor in terms of simulating this kind of data entry points. And it's way, way faster that it can do this. And it's way more and deterministic style than it was, for instance, compared to the robotic process automation that was very deterministic style from a logical phase. So it was that, for instance, I needed to turn on my robotic process interface, telling them, you know what, start that program, go under files, open a specific file, then, for instance, go into a specific field, set the cursor and focus onto this, and then start a data entry. And that was very, very deterministic in terms of the description, for instance. And nowadays, with the help of my natural language speaking and computer use automation, I can do it way more easily because I can use my natural language and talk to these things way, way faster.
Okay, so pardon, you're saying a lot. And okay, what do you mean by deterministic style before I even jump into my question?
Yeah. No, for instance, when previously we were jumping into this kind of robotic process automation interface, we did a lot of styles like, here's my trigger. And based on that trigger, I'm using a lot of if-else clauses in there, right? If this, do that. Else, do this. And this kind of deterministic style was a lot of work where typically we have seen so-called robotic process automation teams. So developers really specialize on RPA and trained on that specific RPA software being used, doing all the hard work in terms of lifting and shifting these kind of things to the developers and to the departments inside the business.
Okay, so that helps, and that actually ties into my next question, I guess, right? You're kind of almost setting me up for that. So now you're talking about this world where we lived in the robotic process automation world, right? However, we're in this agentic era now. So why do I care about RPA, or how does it tie now to the agents? How do the two work together? Do they work together? I have so many questions.
Yeah. And this is, for instance, something where I tried, even on my blog site, I tried to bring up these kind of pros and cons and when to use which kind of technology, because sometimes we are so overwhelmed by these kind of announcements that people understand it in a wrong manner. What do I
Right. Yeah.
mean by this? I mean that people were, for instance, doing this kind of 1 and 1 makes 3, which means Microsoft has been announcing this new computer use automation, which means a deprecation all of a sudden ongoing on the classical RPA. And I was facing this question the very first time in a C-level meeting in an EBC, I remember well. And then I said, no, this is not the end of RPA. Right? But it's a new beginning, like you said, because of we now have agents, and these agents are basically operating as tools instructed by me as a human being to do specific work as myself or for myself in terms of being prepared for the next steps that I should take care of as a human being. Which means in this new world of agents, we also need to think about the fact of how does robotic process automation would help me in this case? So can we combine the agent world and the old previous RPA world? And yes, this is still doable, but that would mean that me as an agent creator, I would constantly need to reach out to my RPA developers, asking them to say, you know what? Here's a very, very 30 years old mainframe system, and I need to put data in there. So can you please provide me a robotic process automation, which when I give this robotic process flow data from my side, basically it takes it forward into that system. Well, that would mean a lot of work in back and forth, me describing, hey, what's ongoing. And as we all know it from application world, when it's about application development, it was always the human in the loop which were causing the difficulties, right? Because I, for instance, would give my RPA friends description like, hey, I want data to put inside this 30-year-old mainframe system. And then they are coming back and say, hey, please give me a list of which kind of data, right? And then they would prepare for that. Well, and then it would work for a certain amount of days. And then all of a sudden, it's me being approached by somebody else, or it's even that there's a new data entry point in there. And all of a sudden, everything has to be recovered and repeated. So I need to reach out to my RPA friends again and doing this. And that is where we said, well, what is the difference here when I would use computer large language models and computer use automation in there? And that's the beauty. Because I can now use my language, I would say, hey, here's a new data entry in that interface. And that, for instance, is my social security identity number. So please, when you find that field, here's the data in a kind of, let's say, variable that I'm attaching to my process. Given that variable, you please forward this into that specific user interface of this mainframe system. And that is this new beauty where I can combine agents and I combine the strength of still doing an automation, but using my computer in a more sophisticated way, in a more modern way of using my natural language and no longer being the one who needs to request for resources in my RPA department for doing these kind of adjustments.
I'd say, Wendy and I have these discussions at times talking about how do we explain these things to customers. And I love what you said about it's not replacing or deprecating one piece of technology or another. Wendy, thoughts?
Loads. Carsten, I think what I'd like to do is do maybe a rapid fire series of questions with you to really just get into
You're in trouble now, Carsten.
I know. I've got them queued up. Some of the practical how-to, because I think that this helps with the theory, the why, but just kind of boots on the ground for organizations. First of all, if the organizations have already put RPA in place. Do they need to do something to, or I guess even the evaluation criteria? What is the evaluation criteria that they need to have to determine if they need to up-level this with AI?
So first, it's definitely stepping into an agent's world. So the first ask is that a process that I'm facing in front of me, which can be turned into an agentic motion, which means that in future, no longer a simple process run should take care of it. I want this to be done by an agent.
Can you put names to the tools? So
Yeah, for
in
instance,
a Microsoft world? Yeah.
Absolutely. So for instance, think about a typical document processing, right? So a typical document processing of an invoicing that you've previously done with an RPA, due to the fact that the system of record where you want to put the invoice data in doesn't have an API, right? So it's a very old system, a very old financial system, maybe something which is used by your company for a very, very long time. And the company doesn't make any considerations to replace that because, as we all know, what works well, why should I take care of something new? Why should I replace it? So in terms of using products next to this, I could say, okay, here was my Power Automate desktop that I was using to do an RPA process with the help of identifying the user interface and then identifying the process of putting data inside that systems of record. That worked fine from a Power Automate desktop side, but now I need to ask myself, well, if I consider that there is more and more documents incoming through various channels, isn't that a thing where I should think of that an agent of a document processing can do a better stuff, a better work for me and doing this more effective than this deterministic RPA?
Okay, Carsten, here's a scenario. I need a proof of employment letter. How do I do that with RPA and with an agent? If I already have the RPA agent sort of already automating this process, do I now just tack on intelligence on top of it with an agent?
I would certainly recommend considering it as an option, right? And the fact of doing it is because of that you can extend what was previously known as simply grabbing this information and putting it into the systems of records. And now, with this new agent motion, agent thinking, you can basically ask yourself, like, can I put more knowledge into the context of this RPA process to enrich the outcome of this?
So, Carsten, playing devil's advocate here, you mentioned that there is still a place for RPA.
Yes.
When is AI not the right fit for a solution?
Yeah, so AI is clearly not the right fit if I stay, for instance, in a very, very defined way of doing automation and specifically doing this automation in terms of robotic process automation, because my system, for instance, doesn't change. Let's say I have 5 fields and I put 5 fields data in there and it doesn't change over time. And it's no way that I need to enrich this, right? There's no way that, for instance, when I put inside, let's say, an invoice amount or the invoice date, where this invoice is basically putting places into that systems of record, there's no need for going this kind of new computer use automation way, right? Because in the end of the day, you have this defined, you have an RPA development team that basically is using it. Go for it, keep it, right? But as I said, if there is somebody in your department or even outside of your department's ecosystem to consider, hey, I could do more than just these data entry of these 5 fields, that's the way where you need to consider taking into account an embracing of new technology.
Okay, so first off, Carsten, I just asked HAL 9000 if AI is always the solution, and it said yes, that we should always be using AI. So I guess you're wrong, according to Hal. That said, legacy systems, what's a better solution? Is it one better than the other, or is it equivalent? What is it? How do I choose?
Well, the thing is, like I said, in the end of the day, and that is my personal take, I take RPA as a bridging technology, as I said, right? So it's a bridging technology which helped me in terms of overcoming the fact that there's no API endpoint. As I know, I have an option. So I could ask my developers team, for instance, to say, hey, listen, here's my systems of records, and it's a legacy system. Can you extend it with an API? Is it possible? If so, please give me an API because it makes my world a heck of a lot easier. But have you heard about MCP?
Yeah, but I don't know how much we talked about it with our audience. So if you could go ahead and explain it, that would be great.
Well, yeah, so, I was gonna say which MCP, because we have so many acronyms within Microsoft.
That's my acronyms here at Microsoft.
Which one?
Which one? So yeah. MCP, Model Context Protocol. So Model Context Protocol is basically, or was created by Anthropic, but we recently announced that we are going to support this MCP protocol in many of our current portfolios, which means, for instance, that we turn Dataverse into an MCP server, but it also means that, for instance, we are considering MCP being used for Copilot Studio. And doing these kind of agent-to-agent or even agent-to-server communication. And MCP is another bridging technology which enables us to consider an open agentic world. Because in the world of automation, it was always, you have a system, you have a process. I want to connect the process with my system or with my systems, right? And that meant I needed to find ways in terms of doing either an API automation or a robotic process automation. And now with that new world of going open agentic web, I could consider, hey, you know what? There's Wendy's system. There's Ken's system. What would be even better if me, as being a robotic process automation specialist, not asking them to say, hey, I need your UI, I need access to your UI, so I can train my robotic process automation to deal or to interact with your systems of records, it would be way better if I have a kind of discovery service which gives me access and say, hey, Wendy, your server, what is it capable of? Hey, Ken, your server, what is it capable of? And all of a sudden, it will basically dive me into this new world of computer use automation, because then I could say either I'm connecting through yours with the help of MCP server, or I could even say, hey, you're not fast enough. Your servers are basically not, or let's say your developers are not fast enough to turn your systems into MCP servers, but you still provide me with your UI interfaces. So to bridge that time that you need to basically turn your systems into MCP servers, I can use that and use computer use automation, log into your systems, and train my large language model to understand your user interfaces. And then, for instance, I can book my next holidays with Wendy's system, and I can book my governance and my credit cards stuff, for instance, in your system, Ken.
I don't know if we're being typecast there with those systems, but it does make a lot of sense, Carsten, what you're saying. You started this episode by saying that this blog post and these recommendations came out of a series of conversations. So since you're boots on the ground with customers every day, what are some of the success stories or most innovative uses of this technology that you're seeing?
Yeah, so the very first thing, and that is also a recommendation or a key learning that I took out of all of these conversations, is start with a structured process, which means start considering to go into a review process of, for instance, where you have been using robotic process automation for, which means ask yourself if you want to continue to scale out with your robotic process automation team? And where are the boundaries of scaling out with your robotic process automation team? And then when you're doing these kind of things, include a question of saying, hey, we are dealing with a new paradigm shift, which is open agentic web, which means what kind of bridging technologies can we make use of in terms of going and diving into this new future? And that is, for instance, computer use automation, where you can then consider this and being very agnostic in terms of thinking, is there a business value in there? Because in the end of the day, and that is what I get asked all day long, is the CEO kicks in or even the CFO kicks in and say, hey, you know what? 2 years back, we've invested heavily in our RPA software and also in our RPA developer stack, which means training on them, investing in software licenses, and so on and so on. So do you want me to change now immediately in terms of making them from robotic process automation specialists into computer use automation specialists? Or is there something else that you're considering? How do I make business value out of all these kind of technology stacks and all these technology blocks?
So do you have an example of that business value? Like, you don't have to name a customer, but an example of what a customer that you've worked with is doing this right now?
Yeah, so typically, for instance, what we've seen, and I mentioned earlier this document processing automation agent, right? Which was typically, previously, it was a very, very deterministic definition. So it was bounded into a use case scenario. The boundaries were when an email arrives with an attachment, here's the invoice, go and save that invoice into a specific data storage place, and then use OCR technology in terms of figuring out what's in there, and then use the data to transport it and basically fit in my process in terms of doing approval runs, and then also after approvals, get that into the final systems of records. So doing that was very, very well defined as a use case. But then that customer said, you know what, we are onboarding 10 more new suppliers. And now I have the chance of going back to my RPA system and basically tell them, you know, please, dear team, you need to work on these new 10 suppliers because they will use different invoice layouts and different style of communication, because it's no longer just email. It's also the WhatsApp channel, for instance, which comes into place where people approaching us and send us files through. And with that, that was exactly that point in time where that customer said, well, that was a very, very good definition of a process, but how does the new technology stack help me in terms of doing this way faster? And since not every system where I'm connected through has an API these days and has an MCP these days being offered, how can I bridge that time when they will finally be able to give me that access through MCP maybe? How can I bridge this and still generate the business value and make that onboarding of the 10 more suppliers super, super simple and super easy? And we basically considered the computer use automation for this. And we were running through this in an exercise which we typically call a hackathon workshop. And within that 2 hours workshop done with that RPA team, we transformed the RPA team into a CUA team, if you will. And they were capable in terms of coming up in 2 hours with exactly the onboarding of these 10 new suppliers. And that was a wow momentum for all the C-level folks, because they knew how long it took them to do it the RPA old classical way.
Carsten, okay, that was awesome. Just the whole entire session right here. I think that I learned quite a bit myself. And now I feel like personally, I have a lot of homework. Unfortunately, we are now at our time right here. So I'd like to really thank you for educating us. Follow Carsten on LinkedIn. Please follow Wendy. And let's land this plane and see everyone later. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Thanks.